Cheyenne widow and her 2 children collapsed at a white rancher's door. He looked once and said, "Get in." Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The biting wind, a relentless sculptor of the high plains, had carved its harsh artistry into Elias Thorne's face, etching lines of solitude around eyes that had seen too much and felt too little for far too long. His ranch, a solitary sentinel against the vast, unforgiving landscape, was less a home and more a fortress built against the world, each weathered plank and creaking beam a testament to a life deliberately stripped bare. He found a grim comfort in the starkness of it all, in the raw, unvarnished truth of a landscape that demanded resilience and offered no quarter. The silence was his constant companion, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind or the distant lowing of cattle, sounds that merely amplified the echoing emptiness within him. He was a man defined by absence, absence of family, absence of connection, absence of anything resembling warmth. The scars on his hands, a rough map of a lifetime of labor, were no deeper than the invisible ones etched upon his spirit, a testament to betrayals and losses he refused to name, even to himself. He lived by a strict code of survival, a pragmatic, often brutal philosophy forged in the crucible of a land that cared nothing for sentiment. The world, he had learned, was a place of take and be taken, and he preferred to be the former, or at least not the latter. He had carved out his existence from the very earth, demanding sustenance from its stubborn soil, expecting nothing more than what his own sweat and toil could wring from it. And then, the world intruded. A faint, almost imperceptible disturbance on the horizon, a smudge against the deepening twilight, gradually coalesced into 3 figures, faltering, stumbling, their movements as broken as the land around them. He watched from the shadowed embrace of his porch, his hand instinctively resting on the cold steel of the rifle propped against the railing, his breath a phantom plume in the frigid air. Curiosity, a dangerous and unwelcome guest, pricked at him, a flicker of something he had long since extinguished. He stood, a stoic silhouette, his gaze fixed on the approaching specters, a dark premonition settling in his gut like a stone. Their slow, agonizing crawl across the desolate expanse spoke volumes of desperation, of a journey of unthinkable hardship. He told himself it was none of his concern, that he owed them nothing, that the prairie would claim its own, as it always did. But something held him rooted, a strange, undeniable pull that defied his every hardened instinct, every ingrained prejudice. The silence of the plains was broken only by the labored gasps of the approaching figures, growing louder, more distinct, until the sound was a raw, undeniable plea carried on the wind. The figures resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of a Cheyenne woman, her traditional dress tattered and stained, her face a mask of gaunt exhaustion, and 2 small children, their limbs frail reeds against the vastness, clinging to her like fragile shadows. They were little more than wraiths, the very embodiment of starvation and despair, their movements ragged, each step a monumental effort. As they drew closer, the woman's eyes, deep wells of desperation, met Elias's across the widening chasm of their different worlds. There was no defiance in her gaze, only a raw, primal plea for survival, a silent testament to the unimaginable distances they had traveled, the unspeakable horrors they had witnessed. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped, only a whisper of air, a ghost of a word. The children, one no more than a toddler, the other a few years older, stumbled, their small bodies finally giving way, collapsing into the dust just short of his porch. The woman, with a final, heartbreaking gasp, crumpled beside them, a heap of faded cloth and shattered hope. A strange tremor, unfamiliar and unwelcome, rippled through Elias's hardened core. It was not pity, not exactly, but something akin to a gut punch, a visceral recognition of absolute brokenness. He had seen death on the plains, had faced its cold embrace countless times, but this was different. This was not the quick, clean end of a hunted animal, but the slow, agonizing surrender of human beings pushed beyond the very limits of endurance. Their stillness was unnerving, a stark indictment of the world he inhabited, the world that had allowed such a spectacle of suffering to unfold. He stood for a long moment, the wind whipping his hair, his mind a battlefield of conflicting impulses. His pragmatic nature screamed for self-preservation, for the cold logic of turning away, of letting nature take its course. He had no obligation, no reason, no desire to involve himself in their plight. Yet, something in the absolute finality of their collapse, the utter stillness of the children, gnawed at him. He knew the stories, the pervasive prejudices that painted people like them as threats, as enemies, as less than human. He had heard the whispers, the hateful rhetoric, had absorbed it into the very marrow of his bones. But looking at them now, stripped bare of all but their shared humanity, the rhetoric felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the undeniable reality of their suffering. He lowered his rifle, the cold metal a sudden weight in his hand, and took a hesitant step forward. His gaze, usually cold and unfeeling, lingered on the small, still form of the youngest child, a tiny fist clenching a handful of dirt. He looked once, his eyes sweeping over the tragic tableau, the tattered clothing, the emaciated limbs, the desperate plea in the woman's unseeing eyes. And then, the words, gruff and unyielding, ripped from a place deep within him he hadn't known existed. A place where a flicker of something ancient and human still resided. Get in. It wasn't an invitation but an order, a command barked into the desolate expanse, devoid of warmth, yet pregnant with an unspoken urgency. The command, raw and unadorned, hung in the frigid air, a stark contrast to the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. It was not a gesture of kindness, not by any stretch of the imagination, but a guttural response, a primal defiance against the encroaching shadow of death. Elias didn't wait for a reply, didn't expect one. He moved, his movements stiff and deliberate, an awkward giant among the fallen. He knelt beside the woman, his calloused fingers brushing against her cold skin as he felt for a pulse, a flicker of life. It was faint, a fragile flutter, but it was there. He then lifted the youngest child, a feather-light bundle of bones and ragged cloth, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cradled the tiny, unconscious form. The child's weight was almost non-existent, a chilling testament to their prolonged ordeal. The older child, a girl of perhaps 5 or 6, stirred, her eyes fluttering open, wide and dark with fear and exhaustion, fixing on his face. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just stared, her small hand reaching instinctively for her mother's tattered dress. A memory, swift and unbidden, flickered through Elias's mind. A ghost from a past he had painstakingly buried. A similar pair of wide, dark eyes, a small hand reaching, a desperate plea swallowed by the roar of flames and the crack of gunfire. He shoved the memory back, a hot coal pressed deep within his chest, and merely nodded towards the open door. Inside, he grunted, his voice gruffer than he intended, a shield against the rising tide of unwelcome emotion. He carried the younger child. The girl stumbled to her feet, clinging to her mother's arm, and with a superhuman effort, the woman, spurred by the stark command and the silent terror in her daughter's eyes, began to crawl towards the open door, her breath ragged, her every movement a painful testament to her brokenness. Elias watched her slow, agonizing progress, a knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't a man given to introspection, certainly not to sentiment, but the image of her struggling form, driven by a maternal instinct fierce enough to defy the very brink of death, resonated with a disturbing intensity. He hated the weakness he saw, and hated the flicker of recognition of it within himself. It was a mirror of his own past, a reflection of a time when he too had been forced to crawl, albeit in a different kind of wilderness. This encounter was a breach in the carefully constructed walls of his isolation, a violent tearing of the fabric of his solitary existence. He had made a decision, a blunt, instinctive command born of something he couldn't quite name, and now he would have to live with the consequences. The silence of the plains stretched on, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the faint, uneven sounds of desperate survival, of a fragile life clinging to the edge of an abyss, and of a man, hardened by his own unspoken past, reluctantly drawn into a narrative he never sought. Inside the sparse confines of Elias's cabin, the air, usually thick with the scent of tobacco and stale coffee, now carried the faint, unfamiliar aroma of smoke and dust, a scent that clung to the woman and her children like a second skin. He had placed them on rough blankets near the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows that danced across their gaunt faces, emphasizing the sharp angles of bone and the hollows of exhaustion. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, lay still, her breathing shallow and uneven, while the older girl, eyes wide and watchful, huddled protectively over her younger brother, who remained unconscious. Elias stood back, observing them from a distance, a wary sentinel guarding his invaded territory. He offered them water, a simple, clear liquid that seemed to taste of life itself, and watched as the girl drank sparingly, then gently moistened her mother's parched lips. He had no illusions of hospitality, no pretense of welcome. This was a temporary ceasefire in a world that had always been at war. His offer of sustenance was not an act of charity, but a practical necessity, a grim obligation that had spontaneously arisen from the chaos of their arrival. He had thrown a pot of lukewarm stew together, its aroma, thick with root vegetables and meager scraps of salted pork, filling the small space. He placed a bowl on the floor near them, then retreated, settling into his worn armchair, the rifle still within arm's reach. The quiet hum of the fire, usually a comfort, now felt heavy with unspoken questions. He refused to articulate them, even to himself. Their presence was a violation, a disruption of the rigid order he had meticulously built around his life, a disruption that unearthed feelings he thought long dead and buried. He tried to focus on the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the mantel, on the familiar grain of the wood in his hands, but his gaze kept returning to the figures by the fire. He was acutely aware of their fragile existence, of the responsibility he had inadvertently assumed. It was a bitter pill, this sudden tether to lives he didn't know, didn't want to know. He saw the flicker of apprehension in the girl's eyes as she occasionally glanced his way, a primal fear of the unknown, of the powerful, unpredictable white man. He offered no reassurances, no comforting words. Words, he had learned, were often hollow, deceptive things. Action, blunt and unyielding, was the only true measure of a man. The sheer exhaustion eventually claimed the girl, her head drooping against her mother's shoulder, her breathing slowing into the deep sleep of the utterly depleted. Elias watched them sleep, the firelight painting them in a strange, otherworldly glow. For the first time in years, the silence of his cabin felt different, not empty, but heavy with the weight of fragile lives and an uncertain future, a future that had violently collided with his present. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. As the first weak rays of dawn filtered through the cabin window, painting the dusty floorboards in muted hues of gray and gold, the woman stirred. Her eyes, still shadowed with exhaustion, scanned the unfamiliar surroundings, then settled on Elias, who was already up, stoking the fire, his back to them. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitary routines, his broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. The air was thick with the scent of coffee brewing, a bitter, comforting aroma. He poured himself a mug, the clink of porcelain against ceramic sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet space, then hesitated, his gaze drifting to the silent figures by the hearth. He poured another, setting it near the woman, along with a piece of dried venison and a hunk of hardtack. "Eat," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, as he turned back to the window, staring out at the unforgiving landscape. He wasn't looking for a thank you, didn't expect one. He simply stated the pragmatic reality. If they were to survive, they needed strength. The woman sat up slowly, her movements stiff and painful, her gaze fixed on the food. She took a tentative bite of the venison, her eyes closing for a moment, as if savoring the very essence of life returning to her body. The older girl, awakened by the subtle movements, sat up too, her small eyes widening at the sight of the food. She ate with a quiet desperation, tearing at the meat with tiny teeth, her hunger a palpable thing in the small cabin. The youngest child, however, remained still, his breathing shallow, a persistent rattle in his chest. A grim knot tightened in Elias's stomach. He knew the signs of starvation, of illness taking hold. He wasn't a doctor, offered no false hope. The plains had a way of claiming the weak, regardless of their age or innocence. He felt a grudging admiration for the woman, her quiet dignity, her unyielding focus on her children. even as her own body screamed in protest. She had a strength that transcended the physical, a resilience that had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable hardship. He had seen that kind of strength before, in the eyes of men who faced down the impossible, but rarely in a woman, never in someone so utterly broken. He thought of his own past, of the choices that had led him to this desolate place, to this solitary existence. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at him. The desperate plea of a young woman, not unlike this one, her hand outstretched, her eyes filled with a terror that mirrored the one he now saw reflected in the younger girl's wary gaze. He had turned away then, hardened his heart against the pleas, convinced himself that he owed no one anything. The regret, a dull ache he had long suppressed, resurfaced, a bitter taste in his mouth. He clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking rhythmically. He was not that man anymore. Or perhaps he was. But a crack had appeared in the facade, a hairline fracture through which the harsh light of his own buried humanity now threatened to break through. He wouldn't offer comfort, wouldn't offer pity, but he wouldn't let them perish on his doorstep either. Not again. Days bled into a week, each one a slow, measured rhythm of reluctant coexistence within the confines of Elias's cabin. The Cheyenne woman, whose name he learned was Naya, and her daughter, Lyra, slowly regained a flicker of their former strength. But the youngest, a boy named Cale, remained gravely ill, his small body consumed by a fever that raged relentlessly. Elias watched him, a grim reaper in waiting, his medical knowledge limited to what he'd gleaned from a lifetime of tending to injured livestock and occasional, crude self-treatment. He knew what a prolonged fever meant on the plains, the chilling finality of it. He'd tried the few remedies he knew, brewed weak herbal teas, applied cool cloths, but Cale's labored breathing and glazed eyes offered little hope. Naya, with a quiet intensity that belied her fragile state, rarely left Cale's side, her low, rhythmic murmurs a constant prayer against the encroaching darkness. Her devotion was a stark contrast to Elias's own distant, pragmatic approach to life and death. He found himself inexplicably drawn to the sight, a strange, uncomfortable curiosity stirring within him. He had never witnessed such fierce, selfless love. His own life had been devoid of it, a barren landscape of pragmatic decisions and emotional withdrawals. He remembered the cold, detached formality of his own upbringing, the sterile silence that followed his mother's passing, the perfunctory goodbyes before he struck out on his own. He was a product of an entirely different world, one where sentiment was a weakness, and survival the only true virtue. Lyra, meanwhile, had begun to explore the cabin, her initial fear of Elias slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. She was a silent observer, her dark eyes missing nothing, her small hands often tracing the patterns in the worn wood of the table or feeling the rough texture of his blanket. Sometimes, she would draw pictures in the dirt near the hearth with a stick, crude depictions of horses, of buffalo, of stick figures that seemed to embody a deep, unarticulated longing for a life that had been violently disrupted. Elias would catch glimpses of her art, and a strange, unfamiliar ache would spread through his chest. It was the ache of something lost, something he had never known, something he recognized in the simplicity of her drawings. He found himself leaving out small pieces of leftover food for her, things she might enjoy. A small gesture that cost him nothing yet spoke volumes of a subtle shift within him. The unyielding wall he had built around his heart was beginning to show faint cracks. The tension in the cabin was a palpable thing, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their daily routines. It was the tension of different worlds forced together, of unspoken histories, of deep-seated prejudices that lingered like a persistent ghost in the air. Naya and Elias rarely spoke, their interactions limited to brusque necessities, but their silence was thick with meaning, with the weight of their respective pasts and the precariousness of their present. He knew the judgment that would fall upon him if his neighbors discovered the Cheyenne family living under his roof. He knew the vitriol, the accusations, the danger. He had always been a man of iron will, but now, faced with the fragile lives clinging to existence within his walls, a flicker of something akin to fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his carefully constructed indifference. The news, as whispers often do in isolated communities, traveled faster than a prairie fire. It began with Elias's occasional trips into town for supplies, a subtle shift in the usually stoic gazes of the general store owner, a pregnant pause in the conversations of the men gathered outside the saloon. Then came the direct confrontations, the probing questions, veiled at first, then increasingly blunt, laced with suspicion and outright hostility. "Heard you got company, Elias?" Jedediah Cobb, a man whose face was as perpetually scowling as the winter sky, drawled one afternoon, his eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Elias as if he were a specimen under glass. "Cheyenne company, is it?" Cobb was a caricature of the prevailing societal biases, a man steeped in fear and ignorance, his words dripping with a venomous prejudice that reflected the collective anxieties of the era. He was a rancher too, but one whose prosperity seemed to thrive on the misfortune of others, his cruelty masked by a veneer of religious righteousness. Elias simply stared at him, his gaze unblinking, his hand tightening on the sack of flour he carried. He offered no denial, no explanation, only a silence so profound it was almost an act of aggression. Cobb, undeterred, pressed on, his voice rising in volume, drawing the attention of others. "Ain't natural, Elias. Asking for trouble. These savages, they ain't to be trusted. Remember what happened down near Willow Creek? They'll slit your throat in your sleep for a handful of grain." The words were a sharp, brutal echo of the hatred that had shaped the frontier, a narrative of fear and dehumanization that justified unthinkable acts. Elias felt a cold fury simmer within him, a dangerous heat that threatened to erupt. He remembered Willow Creek, not the version Cobb spouted, but the truth of it, the brutal massacre of a peaceful encampment, women and children slaughtered in the name of progress and fear. He remembered the smell of burning flesh, the cries that still haunted his nightmares, a memory carefully suppressed, now clawing its way back to the surface. It was a dark truth he carried, a secret burden that twisted his view of the world and his own place within it. But he said nothing, just turned and walked away, leaving Cobb's indignant sputtering behind him, the weight of the community's condemnation settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The pressure mounted, a steady, insidious force. Anonymous notes were left on his gate, crude drawings of burning cabins, ominous warnings. His cattle sometimes strayed, their fences inexplicably cut. His solitude, once a sanctuary, now felt like a target, a vulnerable, exposed position in a landscape suddenly hostile. He knew he was being tested, pushed to a breaking point. The outside world, with its relentless prejudices and violent fears, was closing in, threatening to shatter the fragile peace he had begrudgingly allowed to settle within his home. He looked at Naya and her children, still recovering, still frail, and he knew he had to choose. The choice was not merely about them, it was about the man he had become, or the man he was fighting not to be. It was about the ghosts of his own past, finally demanding their reckoning, a silent, relentless confrontation with the very foundations of his existence. The escalating tension from the outside world found its brutal echo inside the cabin, coalescing around Kyle, the youngest child, whose fever flared with a terrifying intensity. One evening, as the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the window panes, Kale's small body began to convulse, his breath catching in ragged, desperate gasps. Naya cried out, a raw, primal sound of anguish that tore through the cabin's strained silence, her hands fluttering over her son, helpless, desperate. Lyra, her eyes wide with terror, buried her face in her mother's side, her small body trembling. Elias, who had been cleaning his rifle by the hearth, froze. The rhythmic sound of the convulsions, the guttural cries from Naya, ripped through his carefully constructed indifference, striking a chord deep within him that resonated with a long-buried trauma. It was the sound of a mother's helplessness, a sound he had heard before, echoing from a past he had tried to obliterate. He saw not just a Cheyenne boy struggling for life, but a fragile human existence teetering on the precipice, a mirror reflecting a tragedy he had once witnessed, a moment where he had chosen to turn away. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and fear, the flickering firelight casting monstrous shadows that danced and writhed around Kyle's small, writhing form. Elias rose, his movements stiff, almost mechanical, his heart hammering against his ribs. He approached the boy, kneeling awkwardly beside Naya, his gaze fixed on Kale's contorted face. There was nothing he could do, he knew. He was a rancher, not a healer. But something compelled him, a force beyond his own will, a profound, agonizing recognition of a shared human vulnerability. Naya looked at him, her eyes pleading, desperate, devoid of the earlier suspicion or fear. "He burns," she whispered, her voice hoarse with despair. "He burns, Elias. Please." The sound of his name, spoken by her in that moment of absolute desperation, was a jolt. A bridge unexpectedly formed across the vast chasm that separated them. In that moment, all the societal prejudices, all the historical animosities, all the personal reservations dissolved, leaving only the stark, undeniable reality of a child fighting for his life and a mother's agonizing pain. A flashback, sharp and brutal, sliced through his mind. He was younger, perhaps 20. Flames licked at the sky, casting an orange glow over a scene of chaos and destruction. He saw a young woman, her face streaked with dirt and tears, holding a child, a girl of no more than 3. As soldiers, their faces grim, dragged away her husband. The woman cried out, "Help us, please." Her voice, raw with despair, was strikingly similar to Naya's. Elias, then a raw recruit, had been ordered to stand down, to observe, to do nothing. He had obeyed, his hands trembling, his stomach churning, as he watched the scene unfold, helpless, complicit in the horror. The memory was a festering wound, a testament to a moment when he had failed, when he had allowed fear and obedience to override his nascent humanity. Kyle's convulsions intensified, his small body arching, a fragile vessel on a tempestuous sea. Elias looked from the boy to Naya's anguished face, then back to the boy, the past and present colliding in a blinding flash of agonizing clarity. The choice, stark and unavoidable, stood before him. He could continue to be the hardened, indifferent man, the man who turned away, or he could choose differently, now, when it truly mattered. The weight of the past, a phantom hand on his shoulder, pressed down on Elias as Kale's labored breathing filled the small cabin. He saw not just the present suffering, but the agonizing echo of the day he had failed to intervene, the day he had stood by and watched a similar human tragedy unfold. The memory of the young woman's plea, her desperate, unheard cry, twisted within him, a bitter poison he had carried for decades. He had joined the cavalry young, fueled by a misguided sense of adventure and a naive belief in the righteous cause of progress. He had been present at the Wounded Knee massacre, or rather, its brutal aftermath, not as a direct participant in the initial slaughter, but as part of the mop-up detail, forced to witness the carnage, the indiscriminate brutality, the chilling silence of the fallen. He had seen the terror in the eyes of the few survivors, the stark reality of what pacification truly meant. He had seen women and children, defenseless, ravaged by the very forces he served. And in that maelstrom of horror, he had seen a small child, a girl, clinging to her dying mother, her face smeared with blood and dust, her wide dark eyes fixed on him, a silent accusation. He had been ordered to move on, to leave the dying to their fate, to harden his heart against the inevitable. He had obeyed, his spirit slowly fracturing under the weight of his compliance, his soul irrevocably stained by the horror he had witnessed and the humanity he had suppressed. He had left the cavalry soon after, the glamour of the uniform dissolving into the cold, hard truth of complicity. He fled to the solitude of the plains, seeking to bury the memories, to erase the guilt by embracing a life of harsh isolation, a self-imposed penance. He had built his ranch as a fortress against the world, and more importantly, against himself, against the man he had been, the man who had stood by. But the past, like a relentless phantom, had followed him, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. And now, in the desperate cries of Naya, in the fading breath of Kyle, the past was no longer lurking. It was here, in his cabin, in his face, demanding a reckoning. He looked at Kale, his small body convulsing, his fever-glazed eyes rolling back in his head. The sight was a visceral punch, tearing through the last vestiges of his self-imposed detachment. This was the moment. This was the opportunity to rewrite a part of his story, to defy the man he had been. He didn't know if he could save Kyle, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not stand by and watch another child die, another mother suffer, while he did nothing. The cold, logical part of his mind screamed at him. The risks, the judgment, the danger of helping them. But the other part, the long dormant ember of his humanity, finally ignited into a desperate flame. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant risking everything, even if it meant tearing open the wounds of his past for all to see. With a sudden, decisive movement that surprised even himself, Elias knelt closer to Cale, his large, calloused hand reaching for the boy's forehead. It was burning, a terrifying heat that radiated from the small body. He looked at Naya, his gaze piercing through her fear and desperation. "There's an old woman," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse. "She lives about a half-day's ride north. She's got some knowledge of these things. If anyone can help him, it's her." He didn't offer comfort, didn't promise a cure, but the words, a stark admission of his own inadequacy, were perhaps the most human he had uttered in years. Naya's eyes, wide with a flicker of desperate hope, fixed on his face. She knew the woman he spoke of, the network of healers, often dismissed as mere superstitious figures by the white settlers, was a shared, albeit underground, repository of knowledge. The journey, however, was treacherous, especially with a dying child. It was a gamble against time, against the elements, against the very forces that had brought them to this brink. Elias didn't hesitate. He stood, moving with a newfound urgency. "Get him bundled. We go now." He was a man of action, and in this dire moment, action was the only currency that mattered. He saddled his strongest horse, packed a few meager provisions, and with a grim determination etched on his face, he carefully lifted Cale, wrapping the boy in thick blankets, cradling him against his chest. Naya, still weak but fueled by a mother's fierce will, mounted behind him, Lyra clinging to her. The departure was swift, a silent escape under the cloak of night, leaving the cabin, a temporary sanctuary, behind them. The journey was a brutal ordeal. The bitter wind whipped at them, threatening to tear Kyle from Elias's grip. The terrain was unforgiving, the path barely visible in the faint moonlight. Every jolting step of the horse was a torment to Cale's fever-racked body. Elias held the boy close, his own body a shield against the cold, his mind a relentless torrent of prayer and grim resolve. He pushed the horse, pushed himself, ignoring the burning ache in his muscles, the numbness in his fingers and toes. He could hear Cale's shallow gasps, feel the faint tremor of his convulsions against his chest, and with each mile, the weight of his past choices, the specter of his inaction, pressed down on him, urging him forward, demanding a different outcome this time. He was not just riding to save a child, he was riding to save a piece of himself, to mend a fissure in his soul that had festered for decades. The silence of the plains was broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves, the ragged sounds of Cale's breathing, and Elias's own silent, desperate pleas to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He knew the risks, the danger of being discovered by his neighbors, of being seen aiding a Cheyenne family. He knew the potential consequences, the ruin that could befall him. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Only the faint, fragile beat of a child's heart, a desperate pulse against his own, mattered. The old woman's dwelling, a humble sod house nestled in a secluded valley, appeared as a faint smudge against the pre-dawn sky, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. Elias felt a surge of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. As they finally reached it, the horse stumbling, winded and spent, he dismounted, his legs stiff and aching, his arms numb from cradling Cale. The old woman, her face a tapestry of wrinkles etched by years of harsh sun and countless sorrows, emerged from her dwelling, her eyes, ancient and knowing, immediately assessing the grim tableau. She was a silent, imposing figure, a living embodiment of the land's enduring wisdom. Her gaze, sharp and penetrating, lingered on Elias for a moment, as if she could see the very depths of his soul, the unspoken burdens he carried. She did not question, did not judge, merely gestured for them to enter. The small interior was filled with the pungent aroma of dried herbs and wood smoke, a comforting blend of earthy smells that spoke of ancient healing traditions. Elias gently laid Cale on a bed of furs, the boy's feverish body still trembling. Naya immediately knelt beside her son, her hands reaching for his, her eyes brimming with a desperate, silent plea. The old woman moved with a quiet efficiency, her gnarled hands deftly preparing a concoction of herbs, brewing a potent mixture that filled the air with its sharp, medicinal scent. She administered the brew to Cheyenne, then began to chant softly, her voice a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air, a sacred sound that resonated with the raw, untamed spirit of the land. Elias watched, a skeptical observer, yet something in the ancient ritual, in the unwavering conviction of the old woman, chipped away at his cynicism. He was a man of science, of tangible proof, but here, in this sacred space, surrounded by the echoes of a wisdom far older than his own, he found himself unexpectedly swayed by the sheer force of belief, by the raw power of hope. He realized, with a profound clarity, that his own world, narrow and pragmatic, had always been devoid of such deep, spiritual connection, a profound absence that had left him adrift and alone. He looked at Naya, her face streaked with tears, yet her eyes fixed on her son with an unwavering faith. He saw the resilience, the unyielding spirit of a people who had faced unimaginable hardship, a spirit that transcended the brutal realities of their existence. The hours that followed were a blur of anxious waiting, punctuated by the old woman's chants and the restless stirrings of Cheyenne. The boy's fever raged, then slowly, miraculously, began to subside. By dawn, Chayenne's breathing was steadier, his body less convulsed. He was still weak, still pale, but the imminent threat of death had receded, replaced by the fragile tendrils of hope. Elias felt a profound tremor of relief, a loosening of the tight knot in his chest, a sensation he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He looked at the old woman, then at Naya, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He had risked everything for this, for a chance at redemption, and in this quiet, sacred space, a different kind of life had begun to emerge, born from the ashes of his past. The journey back to Elias's ranch was different. The silence that enveloped them was no longer heavy with despair, but with a quiet, fragile hope. Cheyenne, though still weak, was breathing steadily, sleeping fitfully in Elias's arms. Naya, her face still gaunt, radiated a profound relief, her gaze often resting on Elias, a silent acknowledgement of his role in her son's survival. Lyra, sensing the shift, even smiled faintly, a small, tentative flicker of light on her young face. Elias, too, felt a profound shift within him. The immense weight of his past, the haunting specter of Wounded Knee, still lingered, a dull ache in his soul, but it was no longer a crushing burden. He had faced it, finally, not with words or apologies, but with action. He had chosen differently this time, defied the man he had been, and in doing so, had begun to heal a part of himself he thought irrevocably broken. He knew the world outside his ranch, the world he was returning to, was still riddled with prejudice and danger. His decision to help a Cheyenne family, to risk his standing, his property, perhaps even his life, would not be easily forgotten or forgiven by the hostile community that surrounded him. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the solitary rancher. He was Elias Thorne, the man who had brought a Cheyenne family into his home, a living symbol of defiance against the prevailing hatred. He was prepared for the consequences, for the ostracization, for the escalating threats. He had faced down fiercer battles, both external and internal. The solitude he had once craved now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, a place he had hidden himself away from the very humanity he was now reluctantly embracing. He realized, with a profound clarity, that true strength lay not in isolation, but in connection, in the courage to choose compassion over fear, humanity over prejudice. He had found a purpose beyond mere survival, a purpose that resonated with a deeper, more profound truth. The ranch, once a bleak testament to his solitude, now held the promise of something new, something fragile, yet profoundly significant. He was still a man of few words, still gruff, still haunted by his past, but a subtle change had settled over him, a quiet transformation that had unfolded in the crucible of their shared ordeal. The landscape around them, once a symbol of his isolation, now seemed to hold a different meaning, a vast, open expanse of possibilities. He was no longer just a solitary figure against the horizon, but a man carrying the weight of new responsibilities, embracing a future that was uncertain, yet imbued with a newfound sense of purpose. The sun began to climb higher, painting the plains in hues of amber and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness from which they had emerged. Elias looked at Cale, then at Naya, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a faint flicker of hope, a fragile seed planted in the barren soil of his hardened heart, promising a different kind of harvest. Back at the ranch, the atmosphere was different. The initial tension had eased, replaced by a quiet, often unspoken understanding. Kyle, slowly but steadily, began to recover, his small, emaciated frame gaining strength with each passing day. Lyra, her fear of Elias slowly transforming into cautious trust, began to play, her soft giggles occasionally echoing through the cabin, a sound Elias hadn't heard in years, a sound that pierced through his hardened exterior and stirred something long dormant within him. Naya too started to mend, her movements becoming more fluid, her eyes losing their haunted emptiness. She still moved with a quiet dignity, but a faint light had returned to her gaze, a spark of resilience that had been buried under layers of grief and hardship. She began to help Elias with chores, her hands, accustomed to work, moving with practiced efficiency. She taught Lyra and Cale lessons in their own language, stories of their people, of their heritage, quiet murmurs that filled the cabin with sounds alien yet strangely comforting to Elias. He watched them, often from a distance, observing the easy grace of their movements, the deep bond between them, the quiet strength that flowed beneath their quiet demeanor. He was still a man of routine, of solitude, but his world had irrevocably expanded, filled with new sounds, new smells, new responsibilities he had never anticipated. He learned to share his space, to tolerate the intrusion, and even, in the quiet moments, to find a strange comfort in their presence. He understood, with a profound clarity, that he was no longer alone, not truly. The outside world, however, was far from accepting. The threats escalated from veiled warnings to open hostility. His fences were not just cut now, but pulled down, his cattle scattered. Stones were thrown at his cabin windows, often accompanied by hateful jeers and crude epithets yelled from passing riders. Jedediah Cobb, a self-appointed spokesman for the community's darkest prejudices, rode by frequently, his scowl deepening, his warnings growing more explicit, threatening outright violence if Elias did not rid himself of the savages. Elias felt the pressure, the chilling reality of his isolation, but he stood firm. His decision had been made, forged in the crucible of Kyle's illness and his own past. He would not turn them away. He would not repeat his past failures. He spent his days repairing fences, securing his property, his rifle always within reach. He was a man prepared for a fight, not just for his land, but for the fragile peace he had found within his walls, for the lives he had, however reluctantly, taken under his protection. The irony was not lost on him. He, a man who had sought to bury himself in the desolate vastness of the plains, was now a reluctant guardian, a protector of the very people his former life had taught him to fear and despise. He was no hero, not in the traditional sense, but a man driven by a profound, if unspoken need for redemption, a desire to rewrite a chapter of his own bleak history. He saw the world with new eyes, stripped of the prejudices that had once blinded him, seeing the inherent humanity in those he had once been taught to demonize. The quiet rhythm of life at the ranch was now punctuated by the constant threat of outside violence, a tense coexistence that mirrored the larger conflicts of the era. But within the cabin, a fragile sanctuary had been built, a testament to unexpected compassion in a world consumed by hatred. The day the riders came, the sky was an unforgiving canvas of steel gray, heavy with the promise of a coming storm. Elias had sensed it, not just the weather, but the shift in the air, the palpable tension that had been building for weeks. He had seen the gathering storm in Jedediah Cobb's eyes, in the tightened lips of the townspeople, in the increasing frequency of the petty acts of sabotage. He stood on his porch, his rifle cradled in his arms, his gaze sweeping the horizon. His heart, usually a stone within his chest, beat with a dull, heavy rhythm, a drumbeat of anticipation. He watched as a dozen riders, Cobb at their head, emerged from the distant hills, their figures silhouetted against the bruised sky, their intentions clear and ominous. They were a menacing tide, representing the collective fear, ignorance, and hatred that simmered beneath the surface of the frontier. A mob fueled by prejudice and the brutal certainties of their narrow world. Elias didn't flinch. He had known this day would come. Naya, sensing the danger, had instinctively gathered Lyra and Kael, pulling them close, her eyes, wide with a familiar terror, fixed on Elias. She knew the history, the brutal realities of what mobs like this did to her people. She didn't speak, but her silence was a desperate plea, a primal instinct for survival etched onto her face. "Stay inside," Elias rumbled, his voice low and steady, though it felt like gravel in his throat. He looked at her, a silent acknowledgement of the fear, a promise of protection that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The riders approached, their horses kicking up dust, their faces grim and determined. Cobb reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his eyes cold and hard fixed on Elias. "This ends today, Thorn," he bellowed, his voice raw with self-righteous anger. "You can't harbor savages under your roof and expect to live in peace. The community won't stand for it. We've come to put things right." His words were a mirror of the era's brutal rhetoric, a justification for violence cloaked in the guise of law and order. Elias remained silent, his grip on the rifle tightening, his gaze unwavering. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he would not yield. He had chosen his path, faced his demons, and he would stand by his decision, whatever the cost. The air was thick with tension, a palpable hum that vibrated with suppressed violence. A young man, barely more than a boy, spurred his horse forward, raising a torch, his eyes alight with a dangerous fanaticism. "Burn it down," he yelled, his voice cracking with eagerness, embodying the unthinking brutality of the mob. The others roared in agreement, their shouts echoing across the desolate plains, a chorus of hatred that seemed to swallow the very light from the sky. Elias raised his rifle, aiming directly at the torch, his finger hovering over the trigger. This was the moment of truth, the climax of his internal struggle, the definitive break from his past. He would not stand by this time. He would not let history repeat itself. The wind howled, a mournful lament, as the storm clouds gathered, mirroring the tempest that raged within him and around him. A shot cracked through the tense silence, not from Elias's rifle, but from somewhere behind Cobb, a warning shot perhaps, or a stray bullet from a nervous hand. The sudden sound shattered the mob's frenzied momentum, causing a ripple of confusion. In that brief moment of disruption, Elias lowered his rifle slightly, not in surrender, but in a calculated tactical shift. His gaze sweeping over the faces of the men, he saw the raw fear in some, the hardened prejudice in others, the unthinking malice that twisted their features. He saw, too, the flicker of hesitation in a few, the wavering resolve that often characterized a mob on the cusp of true violence. "You think you're righteous?" Elias's voice, low and rough, cut through the residual clamor, carrying an unexpected weight. His words, delivered with a stark, brutal honesty, were laced with a bitter irony, a direct challenge to their self-righteous facade. "You think you're bringing order? You're bringing destruction." Just like before, he let the words hang in the air, a silent accusation, a veiled reference to the past he knew some of them, or their fathers, had played a part in. He knew the stories, the massacres, the land grabs disguised as progress. He was speaking not just to them, but to the ghosts that haunted the very ground they stood on, the brutal legacy that defined their existence. His gaze, piercing and unwavering, fixed on Cobb, a man who built his fortune on the backs of others, a man who preached hatred from a position of comfortable ignorance. "You think you're better than them?" Elias continued, his voice rising slightly, now infused with a raw, undeniable emotion. "You know nothing of their struggle, nothing of their strength. You know only fear. And that fear makes you blind. It makes you weak." The words hit their mark, striking at the very core of Cobb's manufactured authority. The man's face reddened, his jaw tightening, but the usual bluster was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Elias then stepped forward, leaving the sanctuary of his porch, standing exposed before the angry mob, his defiance absolute. "This land," he swept his hand across the vast, unforgiving plains, "it belonged to them long before we ever tainted it, and they've suffered more at our hands than you'll ever know." He wasn't pleading, He was declaring, laying bare an uncomfortable truth that shattered the convenient narrative of their shared history. He was speaking not as a white rancher, but as a man who had seen the brutal realities of conquest, a man who carried the heavy burden of complicity. He was making a stand, not just for Naya and her children, but for a deeper principle of justice, for a reckoning with the past. The raw emotion in his voice, the stark truth of his words, had an unexpected impact. The mob, accustomed to an easy target, to a man who would simply fold, hesitated. Some of the riders exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier fervor dampened by the unexpected confrontation, by the uncomfortable mirror Elias held up to their own prejudices. The tense standoff stretched on, a silent battle of wills, Elias's unwavering resolve against the collective hatred of the mob. The storm clouds above them rumbled, mirroring the deep, unsettling tremor that had begun to ripple through the rigid certainties of the frontier, a crack appearing in the very foundation of its brutal, unquestioned authority. The tension, thick and suffocating, hung in the air, a volatile mixture of fear, hatred, and an uneasy confusion. Elias stood, still exposed, still defiant, his words having pierced the hardened shell of the mob's collective consciousness. Cobb, his face a mask of thwarted fury, finally broke the silence. "You're a fool, Thorne," he spat, his voice trembling with frustrated rage. "A traitor to your own kind. You'll regret this." He wanted to lash out, to punish Elias for his unexpected defiance, for his refusal to conform to their rigid worldview. But the unified front of the mob had fractured. The uncomfortable truths Elias had spoken, the sheer, raw conviction in his voice, had sown seeds of doubt, had pricked at the dormant conscience of some, while others simply recoiled from the open display of emotion. A few of the younger men, their faces flushed with a mixture of shame and uncertainty, began to shift uneasily in their saddles. Their courage, fueled by numbers and a shared sense of righteousness, had begun to falter in the face of Elias's unyielding defiance. The rain, which had been threatening for hours, finally began to fall. A cold, insistent drizzle that slowly intensified, mirroring the dampening of the mob's fervent anger. The physical discomfort, combined with the psychological discomfort of Elias's words, began to erode their resolve. Cobb, seeing his hold on the mob slipping, his authority challenged and diminished, finally snapped his reins. "Let him rot then," he snarled, his voice thick with defeat. "Let him rot with his damn savages." He wheeled his horse around, riding away in a cloud of spray and frustration, followed by a handful of the most hardened and unyielding members of the mob. The rest, their fervor broken, their determination eroded by the cold rain and Elias's unflinching gaze, slowly dispersed. A disorganized retreat. They melted back into the gray, rain-swept landscape, leaving Elias standing alone on his land, wet and exhausted, but victorious. The immediate threat had receded, but the victory was a fragile one, echoing the larger, ongoing conflicts that plagued the era. This wasn't the end of their prejudices, or the eradication of the hatred that permeated the land, but it was a battle won, a stark declaration of humanity against the prevailing tide of dehumanization. Elias watched them go, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and a profound, lingering adrenaline. He lowered his rifle, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hands, and turned towards his cabin. Naya stood in the doorway, Lyra and Kale peeking from behind her, their eyes wide, watching him with a mixture of awe and relief. There were no words, none needed. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the ordeal they had faced, and the bond that had been forged in the crucible of defiance. He had chosen, finally, to stand not with his own kind against another, but with humanity against hatred. He had faced his past, defied its lingering grip, and in doing so, had found a fragile peace within himself. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust, leaving the land clean, perhaps, for a new beginning. The aftermath settled over the ranch, a quiet, almost reverent calm that followed the storm, both literal and metaphorical. The rain had washed away the tracks of the mob, but not the memory of their hatred, nor the profound impact of Elias's defiant stand. The external threat, though temporarily quelled, lingered like a distant thunder, a constant reminder of the societal prejudices that still permeated the land. Yet, within the confines of Elias's cabin, a different kind of life had begun to blossom. A fragile sanctuary forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The days now held a new rhythm, a blend of work and shared existence that Elias had never known. Naya and Lyra helped with the chores, their movements quiet and efficient, their presence a subtle but undeniable comfort. Kyle, fully recovered, his laughter now a bright, joyous sound, often played in the yard, his small form a vivid splash of life against the muted tones of the prairie. Elias still spent long hours tending his cattle, repairing the fences, his hands calloused and strong, but his solitude was no longer absolute. He would return to a cabin that held the scent of Naya's cooking, the sound of Lyra's quiet humming, the occasional echo of Kyle's playful shouts. The silence of his evenings was now punctuated by the soft murmur of their conversations, a language he did not understand, but which resonated with a warmth he had long forgotten. He found himself watching them, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, contemplative gaze, observing the simple beauty of their resilience, the deep connection that bound them. He learned to see beyond the stereotypes, beyond the ingrained prejudices of his upbringing, to recognize the profound humanity that had been hidden from him for so long. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadows of his past, nor the man consumed by guilt. The scars of wounded knees still ached, a deep, resonant reminder of a horrific past, but they were no longer festering wounds. They were transformed, now, into a quiet testament to his journey, to the choices he had made, to the man he was slowly becoming. He was still Elias Thorne, the gruff, solitary rancher, but within him a profound transformation had taken place. He had found not just redemption, but a new understanding of his place in the world, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The future was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but it was no longer a bleak, empty expanse. It was a landscape of possibility, a new horizon imbued with a fragile yet persistent hope. The ranch, once a fortress against the world, had become a haven, a place where different lives had converged, where old wounds had begun to heal, and where, against all odds, a different kind of family had been quietly, profoundly formed. The wind still howled across the plains, but now its mournful lament was softened by the faint, new sounds of life, of laughter, and of a fragile, enduring peace.